Have you ever noticed that the moments you stop trying to fix your relationship are often the moments it begins to heal on its own? What if the secret to attracting love back into your life does not lie in conversation, effort, or even action, but in what you assume as you fall asleep? Tonight's message is about how consciousness moves when the body rests, how relationships respond when resistance ends, and how the state you enter before sleep quietly rearranges the behavior of the one you love. Have you ever asked yourself why love feels hardest to reach precisely when you want it most? Why the more you try to fix a relationship, explain yourself, or seek reassurance, the further harmony seems to drift away? This question is not meant to frustrate you. It is meant to awaken you. Because the answer reveals a law that governs every relationship without exception. Life does not respond to effort. It responds to assumption. I discovered this truth not through theory, but through experience. There was a time when a relationship I valued appeared to grow cold. Words became careful, silences longer, and I found myself mentally rehearsing conversations, trying to find the right thing to say or do. Yet nothing changed. In fact, the more attention I gave to the problem, the more real it became. That was the moment I realized I was attempting to change an effect while remaining loyal to its cause. The cause was not the other person. The cause was the state I occupied within myself. That night, instead of revisiting the day or imagining explanations, I did something entirely different. I abandoned the struggle. As I prepared for sleep, I asked myself a simple question. How would I feel if this relationship were already harmonious, already affectionate, already secure? I did not attempt to visualize scenes or repeat phrases mechanically. I allowed myself to feel the relief of emotional safety, the quiet joy of being chosen, the natural ease of mutual affection. Sleep is not rest alone. It is surrender, and surrender is the doorway through which assumptions pass unchallenged into consciousness. When the body sleeps, the mind no longer argues. It does not analyze probability. It accepts impressions as facts. Whatever state you enter at that moment is received as truth, and what consciousness accepts must externalize itself in experience. This is why what you assume while falling asleep is far more powerful than what you affirm while awake. Relationships do not improve because another person decides to change. They improve because you cease occupying the state that demands change. The moment you internally experience yourself as loved, valued, and secure, the world reorganizes to confirm that assumption. Not symbolically, literally. I noticed something remarkable within days. Not because I was watching for it, but because it unfolded naturally. Communication softened. Affection returned without discussion. There was no dramatic reconciliation scene, no explanation offered or requested. Life simply reflected the new state I had accepted as true. This is the essence of what many call a rampage, not an emotional outburst, but a quiet, deliberate movement of feeling. It is the sustained acceptance of fulfillment without contradiction. When you fall asleep feeling chosen, you are not hoping for love, you are consenting to it. Your partner does not respond to your words, your needs, or your fears. They respond to the version of yourself you are conscious of being. Inner conversations become outer behavior. Silent assumptions become spoken actions. And this occurs without force, without manipulation, without effort. To improve a relationship, then, is not to correct another person. It is to withdraw awareness from lack and place it firmly upon fulfillment. The subconscious mind does not understand absence. It understands feeling. Give it the feeling of being cherished, and it will reproduce the conditions that make that feeling logical. Do not measure results. Measurement implies doubt. Do not repeat techniques mechanically. Technique is only a doorway. The state is the destination. Persist not in words, but in identity. Become inwardly the one who is loved, and you will never again ask how love arrives. As you fall asleep tonight, do not seek signs, seek stillness. Let the last feeling you carry into sleep be the quiet certainty that the relationship you desire already exists in consciousness. And remember this always: what feels natural to you becomes unavoidable in your world. Have you ever stopped to question why the same patterns repeat themselves in your relationships, even when the people involved change? Why affection seems effortless at one time and strained at another, despite no visible cause? This question is not meant to trouble you. It is meant to direct your attention inward, because the answer does not exist in circumstances, behavior, or chance. It exists in consciousness itself. Consciousness is not something you possess, it is what you are. Every experience you call a relationship is first an inner state before it is an outer fact. The world you encounter does not initiate events, it reflects them. What you are conscious of being determines what you experience being done to you. This is not philosophy, meant for contemplation alone. It is a practical law, operating impersonally and precisely at every moment of your life. Most people believe relationships are governed by compatibility, communication, or effort. While these appear to play a role, they are not causes. They are effects. The true cause is the assumption you hold about yourself in relation to another. If you are conscious of being valued, you will experience value. If you are conscious of being neglected, life will present situations that confirm neglect. Consciousness never argues with itself, it only expresses itself. You do not attract what you want. You attract what you are aware of being. This is why attempting to change a relationship through force, persuasion, or emotional pressure rarely produces lasting harmony. Such actions are efforts to rearrange shadows while leaving the substance untouched. When consciousness remains unchanged, conditions must eventually revert to their former pattern, regardless of temporary improvement. To understand consciousness as the sole cause is to understand responsibility, not blame. You are not responsible for the actions of others in a moral sense, but you are responsible for the state from which you view yourself. Others reflect that state faithfully, not because they choose to, but because they must. Life has no option but to express the assumptions held within consciousness. When a person says, "I always give more than I receive," or "love never stays," they are not describing fate, they are declaring a state. That declaration, whether spoken or silently assumed, becomes the lens through which all interaction is filtered. Consciousness accepts it as truth, and experience arranges itself accordingly. This is not punishment or reward, it is law. The difficulty most encounter is not in understanding this intellectually, but in accepting it emotionally. The mind resists letting go of conditions as causes because it appears easier to change another than to change oneself. Yet true change requires no confrontation, no explanation, and no agreement from the world. It requires only a shift in awareness. A change in consciousness is not achieved through willpower. It is achieved through assumption. To assume is to occupy mentally the state you would hold if your desire were already fulfilled. This occupation must feel natural, not forced. Consciousness only externalizes what feels real. When a state feels natural, it has been accepted. Once accepted, it must objectify itself. This is why inner conversations matter more than outer ones. The silent dialogue you maintain with yourself about your worth, your desirability, and your place in a relationship is the script from which others unconsciously read. They do not respond to your spoken demands. They respond to your inner certainty or lack thereof. If you believe you must prove your value, life will provide endless opportunities to prove it, yet never confirm it. If you know your value as a settled fact, life will reflect that knowing without effort. Consciousness does not respond to pleading. It responds to conviction. To accept consciousness as the only cause is to abandon superstition about chance and dependency on external validation. It is to recognize that nothing comes to you uninvited by your state of being. This recognition is not meant to induce fear or self-judgment. It is meant to grant freedom. For if consciousness creates, then consciousness can recreate. The moment you stop identifying yourself with lack, you withdraw the energy that sustains it. The moment you assume fulfillment, you set in motion a sequence of events that must lead to its expression. You need not outline the path. Consciousness contains its own method. Education in this law is not about memorizing statements or repeating phrases. It is about learning to observe yourself honestly. What do you fear to be true about yourself when no one is watching? What state do you return to when effort ends and thought relaxes? That state is your cause. When you grasp this, relationships cease to be arenas of struggle and become mirrors of understanding. You no longer attempt to control outcomes. You change states. And as states change, experiences follow as faithfully as a shadow follows form. This is not theory meant to inspire hope. It is a principle meant to be tested. Assume a new concept of yourself, persist in it gently, and watch how life reorganizes without command or conflict. Consciousness will always prove itself right. Have you ever wondered why two people can desire the same outcome in a relationship, yet only one experiences it with ease, while the other struggles endlessly? Why longing, effort, and emotional investment often fail to produce attraction, while calm certainty seems to invite it naturally? The answer lies not in the intensity of desire, but in the nature of assumption. Assumption is not wishful thinking. It is not hope dressed up as belief. An assumption is a state of consciousness accepted as true, whether or not there is evidence to support it. Life does not wait for proof before responding. It responds to the state you occupy. What you assume to be real about yourself and your relationship becomes the framework through which experience unfolds. Emotional attraction does not arise because someone decides to be drawn to you. It arises because you have entered a state in which being desired feels natural. Attraction is a reflection, not an initiation. The subconscious mind does not reason, it accepts. And whatever it accepts as true, it projects outward as experience. This is why assumption, not effort, governs emotional response. Most people confuse desire with assumption. Desire implies absence. It states, often silently, "I do not have." Assumption implies presence. It declares, without words, "This is so." Consciousness cannot produce what is contradicted by the state you are in. When you desire love while feeling unwanted, the feeling of being unwanted is the assumption that prevails. Life faithfully mirrors it. To understand the role of assumption in emotional attraction, you must observe your inner posture rather than your outer behavior. You may say all the right things, act with generosity, and show patience, yet if inwardly you feel uncertain, replaceable, or overlooked, that feeling is the message received by consciousness. Others respond to that message without knowing why. Assumption operates continuously. It does not turn on when you practice techniques and turn off when you stop. Every moment, you are assuming something about yourself. The question is not whether you are assuming, but what you are assuming. Are you conscious of being chosen or of waiting to be chosen? Are you aware of being secure or of guarding against loss? Emotional attraction follows these answers, not your intentions. A state assumed with feeling becomes identity. When identity shifts, behavior around you shifts as well. This is why true attraction feels effortless. No persuasion is required when the assumption has already been accepted. Others are compelled to play the role that matches the state you occupy, just as actors follow a script already written. It is important to understand that assumption does not force another's will. It does not manipulate or control. It simply aligns experience with consciousness. The world is not pushed, it is rearranged. When you assume yourself to be loved, the conditions that make that assumption reasonable must appear. How they appear is not your concern. Consciousness organizes its own expression. Many attempt to use words to create assumption, but words alone are insufficient. Feeling is the language of the subconscious. A phrase repeated without emotional acceptance is empty. But a single feeling accepted as true, even briefly, can outweigh hours of verbal repetition. What you feel to be real is what consciousness acts upon. This is why moments of quiet certainty are more powerful than emotional intensity. Calm acceptance impresses more deeply than desperation. When you relax into the assumption of being desired, you remove resistance. Resistance is not opposition, it is contradiction. You cannot assume fulfillment while emotionally occupying lack. To educate yourself in assumption is to learn how to enter states deliberately. This is not achieved by force. It is achieved by asking a simple question: how would I feel if this were already true? Then allowing that feeling to arise without interference. The feeling may be subtle. Subtle is sufficient. Consciousness responds to quality, not volume. As assumption becomes habitual, emotional attraction becomes stable. You no longer oscillate between hope and doubt. You no longer look for signs. Signs follow, they do not proceed. The moment you seek confirmation, you have left the state. To remain in assumption is to remain faithful to the feeling, regardless of appearances. Education in this law requires patience with yourself. Old assumptions do not dissolve instantly because they have been reinforced by repetition. But repetition does not mean struggle. It means returning gently and consistently to the chosen state. Each return weakens the former assumption and strengthens the new one. When assumption changes, attraction changes without effort. Conversations soften. Attention increases. Affection feels spontaneous rather than earned. These are not miracles, they are reflections. Consciousness simply proves itself correct. To understand the role of assumption in emotional attraction is to reclaim authorship over experience. You stop reacting to behavior and begin selecting states. You stop asking how to be loved and begin knowing yourself as lovable. From that knowing, all else follows naturally, without command, without demand, and without strain. Why is it that the more a person tries to hold a relationship together, the more fragile it seems to become? Why does constant effort, explanation, and emotional labor so often lead to exhaustion rather than intimacy? These questions reveal a misunderstanding that is deeply rooted in how most people approach love. They believe relationships are sustained by effort, when in truth, effort is often the very thing that signals inner conflict. Effort arises from the assumption that something is missing or unstable. When you feel the need to fix, convince, or maintain through strain, you are inwardly declaring that harmony is not natural. Consciousness accepts that declaration without judgment and faithfully reproduces experiences that confirm it. In this way, effort does not heal a relationship, it broadcasts the belief that it requires repair. Love does not respond to pressure. Emotional connection is not persuaded into existence. It emerges when there is alignment between inner state and outer expression. When effort dominates, alignment is absent. Effort implies resistance, and resistance always precedes struggle. This is not a moral failing, it is a mechanical consequence of how consciousness operates. To understand why effort damages intimacy, one must observe the feeling beneath it. Effort is usually accompanied by fear of loss, fear of being replaced, fear of not being enough. These feelings, when accepted as true, become the operative state. The relationship then mirrors that state, not because anyone intends harm, but because consciousness can only express what it contains. Restoration begins not with doing less externally, but with assuming more inwardly. When you assume yourself to be secure, valued, and chosen, effort becomes unnecessary. You do not struggle to maintain what you know belongs to you. Ease is not laziness. It is confidence embodied. And confidence is attractive precisely because it is free of demand. Assumption restores intimacy because it changes the source. Instead of attempting to influence another's behavior, you alter the state from which interaction arises. This is the only level at which true change occurs. Behavior follows state as a shadow follows form. When the state changes, behavior must follow without instruction or negotiation. Many misunderstand assumption as passive waiting. It is not. It is active acceptance. It is the deliberate decision to identify with fulfillment rather than lack. This decision does not require visible proof. In fact, waiting for proof is evidence that the assumption has not been accepted. Consciousness does not need reassurance. It needs agreement. When you assume harmony, you cease monitoring the relationship for signs of improvement. Monitoring implies doubt. Doubt keeps effort alive. Assumption dissolves the need to check because it feels settled. From this settled state, responses soften. Communication flows naturally, and affection returns without being summoned. Effort often manifests as overthinking, replaying conversations, predicting outcomes, preparing defenses. These mental activities are not neutral. They impress consciousness with instability. The mind rehearses what it expects, and expectation becomes experience. To withdraw effort is to withdraw rehearsal of lack. This is why relaxation is so powerful in relationships. Relaxation is not indifference, it is trust. When the mind rests from attempting to control outcomes, it allows the assumed state to surface. In that state, you relate from wholeness rather than need. Others feel this shift immediately, even if they cannot explain it. Assumption restores intimacy because it reestablishes emotional equality. Effort often places one person in pursuit and the other in retreat. Assumption dissolves this imbalance by removing pursuit altogether. You no longer seek validation, you express identity. And identity invites response naturally. Education in this principle requires honesty. Ask yourself where effort appears in your relationship. Is it in tone, timing, explanation, reassurance? Each point of effort reveals a point of doubt. Rather than correcting the behavior, correct the assumption beneath it. Replace the feeling of needing to hold with the feeling of being held. Persistence in assumption does not mean tension. It means consistency. You return to the feeling of fulfillment whenever the mind drifts back to effort. Not with criticism, but with awareness. Over time, effort loses relevance because the state that produced it no longer exists. When assumption is stable, intimacy feels simple. There is less need to manage perception and more freedom to be present. This presence is not learned. It emerges naturally when effort ends. Relationships flourish not because they are worked on, but because they are lived from the right state. Effort belongs to the world of effects. Assumption belongs to the world of causes. When you move from one to the other, you do not abandon responsibility, you assume it at its true level. From that level, restoration is not a task, it is a consequence. Have you ever noticed that the mind becomes quieter just before sleep? That the arguments of the day lose their urgency and the need to control events gently fades? This interval, often overlooked, is not a passive descent into unconsciousness. It is the most receptive state the human mind enters each day, and it is here that the foundations of experience are most easily laid. When the body prepares for sleep, the senses withdraw from the outer world. Attention turns inward, and the critical faculties that question, doubt, and resist begin to relax. In this softened condition, impressions pass directly into consciousness without opposition. What is accepted in this state does not remain an idea, it becomes a conviction. And conviction, once established, must express itself as experience. This is why sleep holds such importance in the formation of relationships and emotional patterns. During waking hours, the mind argues with itself. It compares, analyzes, and contradicts. But as sleep approaches, these conflicts lose strength. The mind becomes impressionable, and whatever feeling occupies it at that moment is received as truth. There is no effort required. In fact, effort prevents entry into this state. Most people carry the residue of the day into sleep. They replay conversations, rehearse regrets, and imagine undesirable outcomes. These mental activities, though casual, are powerful. They impress consciousness with lack, tension, or insecurity, which then appear in waking life as repeated experiences. The mind does not distinguish between events imagined in drowsiness and events physically lived. It records feeling, not fact. To educate yourself in the use of sleep is to learn how to select the feeling you fall asleep in. This does not involve forceful visualization or strained concentration. The body must be allowed to relax. The mind must be allowed to drift. Within this drift, a single feeling is enough. That feeling should correspond to the state you wish to experience as natural. If the desired state is harmony in a relationship, then the feeling is not excitement or intensity, but ease. Ease implies resolution. Ease implies security. When you fall asleep feeling at ease about a relationship, you are declaring inwardly that there is nothing to fix. Consciousness accepts this declaration and arranges experience to support it. Sleep is fertile because it removes resistance. Resistance is always active thought opposing acceptance. As thought quiets, resistance dissolves. What remains is pure receptivity. In this receptivity, assumptions take root quickly and deeply. A single night entered correctly can outweigh weeks of mental effort. It is important to understand that sleep does not create new desires. It stabilizes states. Whatever you accept as true while entering sleep becomes the dominant assumption. Repetition is not required in the traditional sense. Naturalness is the key. If the feeling feels forced, it has not been accepted. If it feels calm and ordinary, it has been received. Many mistake this practice as escapism. It is not escape, it is alignment. You are not ignoring reality, you are selecting its cause. The outer world will continue to reflect past assumptions until the new one replaces it. This interval may appear as delay, but it is simply transition. Consciousness reorganizes itself gradually, but faithfully. Education in this principle requires discipline, not strain. The discipline is in awareness. Observe what you habitually take into sleep. Is it worry, longing, resentment, or peace? Whatever it is shaping tomorrow. You are not punished for this habit, you are instructed by it. When sleep is entered consciously, emotional dependence dissolves. You stop needing reassurance from others because you have given it to yourself at the deepest level. From this self, sufficiency arises natural attraction. Others respond to stability more readily than to need. The effect of proper use of sleep is subtle but profound. You do not wake to immediate fireworks. You wake to a changed attitude. That changed attitude alters how you speak, listen, and respond. Those changes invite corresponding responses from others, completing the cycle. Sleep, then, is not an ending. It is a gateway. Each night, you pass through it carrying a state. That state is the seed of future experience. Choose it with awareness, not urgency. Let the feeling be gentle, settled, and unquestioned. Consciousness will do the rest. This is education through practice, not belief. Test it. Observe it. Let experience confirm what reason cannot. When you understand sleep as the most fertile state of impression, you no longer drift into it unconsciously. You enter it as a conscious participant in your own becoming. Have you ever noticed that words can be spoken with great enthusiasm and yet leave no lasting impression, while a quiet feeling, scarcely acknowledged, can alter the entire course of a relationship? This observation points to a fundamental truth. Words do not move the subconscious mind, feeling does. The subconscious is not persuaded by logic, repetition, or explanation. It responds exclusively to the emotional reality you accept as true. Language belongs to the conscious mind. Feeling belongs to the deeper level where patterns are formed and expressed. When people rely solely on words, affirmations spoken mechanically, or statements repeated without conviction, they address only the surface of themselves. The deeper mind remains untouched because it has not received the one thing it understands, a felt experience. Feeling is not emotion in the dramatic sense. It is the quiet sense of being. It is how a state feels when you occupy it naturally. You may say, "I am loved." Yet if the feeling beneath the words is uncertainty, the subconscious receives uncertainty. Consciousness does not evaluate the words. It absorbs the feeling they carry. The feeling is the message. This is why attempts to change relationships through verbal reassurance often fail. You may hear loving words from another, yet if you do not feel secure, the words pass through you without effect. Conversely, a single moment of feeling chosen can dissolve years of doubt without explanation. Feeling speaks directly to the source. To educate yourself in this principle is to learn to distinguish between saying and being. Saying is effort. Being is acceptance. When you assume a state through feeling, you are not trying to convince yourself. You are allowing yourself to experience what would be true if the desire were already fulfilled. This allowance, when natural, impresses the subconscious immediately. The subconscious does not require clarity of imagery. It does not require detailed scenes. It requires only the feeling that implies fulfillment. The simpler the feeling, the deeper its impact. A sense of relief, comfort, or quiet satisfaction is more effective than vivid emotional intensity. Intensity often carries strain. Strain implies lack. Many misunderstand this and attempt to generate emotion forcefully. They try to feel excited, passionate, or euphoric. These states are difficult to sustain and often feel artificial. The subconscious resists what feels unnatural. It accepts what feels ordinary. Feeling, when genuine, has no urgency. It feels settled. This is why feeling is most accessible when the mind is relaxed. When the body is calm and the breath is slow, the feeling of fulfillment can surface without effort. At that point, words are unnecessary. The state speaks for itself. Consciousness records it as fact. Inner conversations play a significant role here. The tone of your inner speech carries feeling. It is not what you say inwardly, but how it feels to say it. An inner dialogue spoken with certainty impresses the subconscious far more than 100 affirmations spoken in doubt. The feeling behind the dialogue is the instruction given. Education in this law requires attention to subtlety. The mind often overlooks small feelings because it seeks dramatic change. But small feelings, when accepted, become dominant. A slight shift from tension to ease is enough. Consciousness does not measure magnitude, it responds to direction. Feeling is also what sustains a state. Words may initiate a practice, but feeling maintains it. When feeling fades, repetition becomes hollow. When feeling is present, repetition is unnecessary. The state continues on its own, influencing perception and behavior effortlessly. This understanding removes struggle from inner work. You no longer ask how often to repeat, how long to visualize, or what exact words to use. You ask only one question: what does it feel like to be in the state I desire? Once that feeling is known, you return to it gently whenever awareness drifts. Feeling is also what allows assumption to become identity. When you feel yourself to be loved, you begin to think, speak, and act from that knowing without intention. This authenticity is what others respond to. They do not respond to your techniques. They respond to your state. In relationships, this principle is especially powerful. You cannot demand emotional response, but you can embody emotional security. You cannot persuade attraction, but you can feel attractive. The subconscious mind of another responds to what you are, not to what you request. To rely on feeling rather than words is not to abandon expression. It is to anchor expression in truth. Words spoken from feeling are effective. Words spoken without it are noise. When you understand this, you stop forcing change and begin allowing it. Education in this principle is lifelong. Each experience teaches you to refine awareness of your inner state. As you grow more sensitive to feeling, you gain mastery over assumption. From that mastery flows consistency, harmony, and ease in every area of life, including relationships. Feeling is the silent cause behind every visible effect. Learn to listen to it, honor it, and let it guide your assumptions. When feeling leads, words follow naturally, and reality follows both without resistance. Have you ever observed that the same type of interaction repeats itself in your relationships, even when you resolve to act differently? You promise yourself you will be calmer, more confident, less reactive, yet the familiar patterns return. This repetition does not occur because you lack discipline or insight. It occurs because behavior is not the source. The source is the inner conversation you maintain with yourself. An inner conversation is the continuous, often unnoticed dialogue that accompanies your thoughts. It is what you say inwardly when no one is listening. These conversations are not harmless reflections, they are creative acts. They establish the tone of your consciousness and determine the roles others play in your experience. You do not speak inwardly, at random. Every inner conversation arises from a state. If you feel secure, your inner dialogue is calm and affirmative. If you feel uncertain, your inner dialogue questions, defends, or anticipates loss. Consciousness accepts this dialogue as truth because it is spoken from identity, not imagination. The outer world mirrors inner conversations with precision. What you repeatedly tell yourself about your worth, your place in a relationship, or how others treat you becomes the pattern you encounter. This is not metaphorical. It is mechanical. Consciousness externalizes what it hears consistently. Most people attempt to change relationships by altering outer speech. They choose words carefully, avoid certain topics, or rehearse responses. While this may produce temporary change, it cannot override the inner script. When inner conversation contradicts outer speech, the inner conversation always prevails. To understand this is to realize why arguments persist even when issues appear resolved. The discussion ends, but the inner conversation continues. It replays the conflict, justifies positions, and predicts future disappointment. Consciousness records this continued dialogue and recreates the conditions necessary for its expression. Education in this principle begins with awareness. You must become attentive to what you say inwardly when you think of the person or relationship in question. Do you rehearse explanations? Do you imagine rejection? Do you mentally defend yourself? Each of these is an instruction given to consciousness. Inner conversations are most powerful when they feel natural. You may not even notice them because they feel familiar. Familiarity is not truth, it is habit. Habits of inner speech create habits of experience. When you change the habit, the experience changes. This change does not require suppression. Suppression creates tension and resistance. Instead, it requires substitution. When you notice an inner conversation that implies lack or conflict, gently replace it with one that implies resolution. Not through forceful affirmation, but through a simple shift in tone. Imagine speaking inwardly from a place where the relationship is already harmonious. What would the conversation sound like? It would not be argumentative or explanatory. It would be brief, calm, and certain. You would not be convincing anyone. You would be acknowledging what is already settled. The content of the conversation matters, less than the feeling behind it. A few words spoken with certainty carry more weight than long dialogues spoken in doubt. The subconscious accepts the tone, not the vocabulary. When the tone changes, the message changes. Inner conversations also influence how you perceive outer speech. When the inner dialogue is secure, neutral words are heard as supportive. When the inner dialogue is defensive, even kind words are questioned. The same outer behavior produces different experiences depending on the inner conversation. This principle explains why two people can hear the same words and interpret them differently. They are not hearing the words. They are hearing their own inner dialogue echoed back to them. Consciousness filters experience through what it already believes. Education in this law requires persistence, but not struggle. Inner conversations shift gradually as states change. You will not silence them entirely, nor should you try. You guide them. You decide from which state they are spoken. The most effective time to influence inner conversation is when the mind is relaxed. In moments of quiet, especially before sleep, the inner dialogue softens. At that time, introduce the conversation that implies fulfillment. Let it feel ordinary. Let it feel unremarkable. That is how it is accepted. As inner conversations change, outer interactions change without effort. Others speak differently. Situations resolve themselves. You are not manipulating behavior. You are altering the script being followed. This understanding removes blame from relationships. You no longer accuse others of causing emotional patterns. You recognize the creative role of inner speech. With this recognition comes freedom. You are no longer at the mercy of reaction. You become the author. When inner conversations align with the state you desire, the world must reflect that alignment. This is not optimism, it is law. Consciousness listens constantly. Choose your inner speech with awareness, and you choose your experience accordingly. Have you ever noticed that the moment you stop watching the clock, time seems to move more quickly? Or that when you stop checking for a message, it often arrives without effort? This is not coincidence. It reveals a principle that governs all fulfillment attachment to outcome delays experience, while detachment allows it to unfold naturally. Detachment does not mean indifference. It does not mean giving up desire or pretending not to care. Detachment is the absence of inner strain. It is the state in which fulfillment is assumed, not awaited. When you are detached, you are no longer looking to the outer world for a confirmation, because inwardly the matter feels settled. The mind that constantly checks for results is a mind that has not accepted the assumption. Checking implies doubt. Doubt implies separation. Consciousness cannot produce what is still being questioned. The very act of looking for proof affirms that proof is missing. Life, obedient to consciousness, continues to reflect that absence. Detachment from outcome is therefore not a technique. It is a condition that arises when the state of fulfillment has been accepted as real. When you know something to be true, You do not monitor it. You do not seek reassurance. You rest. That rest is detachment. Many believe persistence means effortful repetition, emotional intensity, or vigilance. In reality, persistence means remaining loyal to a state without argument. It is quiet fidelity, not anxious maintenance. You persist by returning to the feeling of fulfillment whenever the mind wanders, not by forcing it to stay there through strain. Detachment naturally emerges when the feeling of fulfillment becomes familiar. Familiarity removes urgency. Urgency belongs to lack. When something feels ordinary, it no longer demands attention. This is why fulfilled states are calm. Calmness is not weakness. It is confirmation. The paradox is that detachment does not remove desire, it removes resistance. Desire without resistance moves effortlessly into expression. Resistance is born of fear. Fear that it will not happen. Fear that it will be taken away. Fear that you are not enough. Detachment dissolves these fears by replacing them with quiet knowing. In relationships, attachment to outcome often appears as monitoring behavior, interpreting silence, or assigning meaning to small changes. These actions are not neutral. They impress consciousness with instability. When you detach, you withdraw attention from these interpretations and return it to the assumed state of harmony. Consciousness responds by stabilizing experience. Detachment does not require time. It requires acceptance. The moment you accept the end as real, you are detached from the means. You no longer try to control how it will happen. You allow life to organize itself. This allowance is not passivity, it is trust in law. Education in this principle involves observing your reactions. When you feel compelled to check, question, or adjust, ask yourself what assumption is active. The compulsion reveals doubt. Rather than correcting the outer behavior, correct the inner state. Return to the feeling that implies fulfillment. Persistence, then, is not repetition of words, but consistency of identity. You persist by remaining the person who already has, not the person who hopes to have. This persistence is gentle. It does not argue with appearances. Appearances are effects of former assumptions and will dissolve as the new state stabilizes. Detachment allows appearances to change without interference. When you stop reacting, you stop feeding the old state. Reaction is participation. Detachment is withdrawal of attention. What is no longer attended to loses momentum. Consciousness moves toward what is given life through feeling. It is important to understand that detachment is not suppression. You do not deny thoughts or emotions. You acknowledge them and choose not to identify with them. Identification gives power. Observation dissolves it. When you observe a thought without engaging, you remove its creative force. As detachment deepens, effort fades. You no longer feel responsible for making things happen. You understand that your role is to assume, not to manage. Life handles the details. This understanding brings relief, and relief is a sign that the state has been accepted. Persistence without detachment becomes obsession. Detachment without persistence becomes passivity. The balance is found in loyalty to the state, combined with freedom from outcome. You hold the assumption lightly, but steadily. You return to it naturally, without urgency. This balance produces confidence. Confidence is not bravado, it is quiet certainty. Others feel it immediately. They respond to it because it carries no demand. Demand repels, certainty invites. The world moves toward the state you occupy because there is no resistance within it. To be detached is to trust consciousness as the cause. To persist is to remain faithful to that cause. When these two operate together, fulfillment is inevitable. Not because you chase it, but because you no longer block it. Have you ever noticed that repeating a technique can feel exhausting, while simply remaining in a certain mood or attitude feels effortless. This contrast reveals a misunderstanding that many encounter on this path. They confuse repetition of methods with persistence of state. Techniques are tools, states are causes. When a state is assumed, it does not require constant reinforcement through action. It sustains itself naturally. A technique is something you do. A state is something you are. Doing implies movement towards something not yet possessed. Being implies acceptance of something already true. Consciousness responds to being, not to doing. When you rely on technique alone, you unconsciously affirm that fulfillment is still in the future. When you remain in a state, you affirm that fulfillment is present. Repetition of techniques often arises from doubt. The mind repeats in order to convince itself. But consciousness does not require convincing. It requires agreement. Once a state has been accepted, repetition becomes unnecessary. The feeling of reality replaces the need for effort. This is why persistence is not measured by how often you practice, but by how naturally you return to the assumed state. To persist in a state means to identify with it. Identification is not an act, it is recognition. When you recognize yourself as secure, loved, or fulfilled, you do not need reminders. You respond to life from that position automatically. Thoughts, reactions, and behaviors align without instruction. The state governs expression effortlessly. Many abandon a state because they mistake temporary emotional fluctuations for failure. Emotions rise and fall, but a state remains when it has been accepted. Persistence does not mean maintaining a constant emotional high. It means remaining loyal to the identity implied by the fulfilled desire, even when emotions fluctuate. A state, once assumed, becomes the reference point for perception. You interpret events through it. When something appears to contradict it, you do not panic. You recognize the appearance as residue of a former assumption. This recognition prevents reaction, and non-reaction allows the old state to dissolve without reinforcement. Techniques are useful only insofar as they lead you into a state. Once the state is entered, technique has served its purpose. Continuing to rely on it suggests that the state has not been accepted. Education in this principle requires discernment. Know when to use a method and when to let it go. Remaining in a state requires awareness, not vigilance. Vigilance implies effort and fear of loss. Awareness implies presence. You notice when the mind drifts back to old assumptions and gently return to the chosen state. This return is not forceful. It is familiar. Familiarity is what stabilizes a state. A state persists because it feels natural. Naturalness is the sign of acceptance. If a state feels artificial, it will require effort to maintain. Effort signals resistance. When resistance is absent, persistence is effortless. You are not holding the state is holding you. This understanding removes impatience. You stop asking how long it will take, because time is irrelevant to a state. A state exists now, or it does not. When it exists, it is active regardless of appearances. Appearances follow states, not the other way around. Education in this law shifts focus from action to alignment. Instead of asking what to do next, you ask who you are being. This question is far more powerful. Being determines doing. Doing does not determine being. When you answer the first correctly, the second takes care of itself. Remaining in a state does not mean withdrawing from life. You still engage, communicate, and act. But your actions are expressions, not attempts. You do not act to get, you act because you already are. This distinction changes the quality of interaction. Others feel the difference immediately. A state does not need protection. Protection implies vulnerability. A state needs recognition. Recognition affirms permanence. When you recognize yourself as fulfilled, you do not fear losing it. Fear belongs to lack, Fulfillment is calm. This principle explains why sudden changes sometimes occur after a long period of seeming stagnation. The stagnation was not delay, it was incubation. The state was being stabilized. Once stable, expression appears quickly and naturally. Persistence in a state is the highest form of faith. It is not belief in something unseen, but acceptance of something known inwardly. This acceptance does not shout. It whispers. And that whisper governs experience more powerfully than any declaration. When you understand this, you no longer measure progress by visible signs. You measure it by inner consistency. Are you reacting less? Are you calmer? Are you no longer rehearsing lack? These are indications that the state has taken root. The shift from technique to state is the shift from effort to authority. Authority does not demand, it assumes. And what is assumed, when persisted in as identity, must externalize itself without exception.